Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Roland. I don't get an introduction, so I'm going to introduce myself. I am a senior consultant with Arup Digital Insight Group. I'm based in Los Angeles. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Arup and who we are and what we do, we're basically a large multidisciplinary engineering company. We're based in London in the UK. We have about 12,000 employees worldwide, and we work on a wide variety of projects. For my part, it's normally infrastructure work, so things like rail, highways, that kind of thing. And as I say, I've been based in Los Angeles now for about 3 years, something like that, I think. Now, the nature of working in engineering is that you get a really wide variety of different types of data come flying at you. And you get it from slightly eclectic and unusual sources sometimes. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So, couple of different topics I want to cover today. Firstly, automation, which is my first love and my deepest love. Secondly, ProjectWise. Just before I go any further on that, 2 quick shows of hands. One, is there anyone from Bentley in the room? Excellent. I can be really rude about ProjectWise. That's good. Does everyone know what ProjectWise is? How deeply do I have to go into introducing it? Quick show of hands if you know what ProjectWise is. That's pretty good. That shows why you've bothered coming, which is good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we went about connecting FME to ProjectWise, and I'll go a little bit under the hood with that one. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about how you might apply that to other APIs as well. I maybe don't need to delve too deeply into that since, as we saw, most of us know what ProjectWise is here today. I wanted to put this slide in partly because it made me laugh because I love a good greengrocer's apostrophe, but partly because I wanted to warn everyone we will delve moderately deeply into this. And so if there are any sort of FME beginners in the room, my apologies, this might get quite complicated and convoluted as we go along, but I think we should all be among friends here. So as I say, I love automation. The sort of the mantra of my career has been, if in doubt, automate. And for me, it's not about any of this stuff that I'm sure you've all seen these kind of slides before showing things like if you spend this amount of time working on automating something, then you save this amount of time. Or the one on the left is sort of saying if you're a geek, then you spend the time automating something and then you win because the amount of time you save gets more and more as the project goes on. For me, it's not about any of that, actually. It's purely because I find automation much more interesting than sitting there pressing buttons repeatedly the whole day. I'm sure you all agree with me because that's why we're here at the conference. And the project I'm going to talk about today, the quite nice thing about it is that red line going across on the left-hand chart, it actually continues going, here we go, right the way across the screen. And the win is quite significant on it. So I think there were a couple of people who weren't familiar with ProjectWise, so I will just introduce it briefly. It's a file management system at its most basic. It's usually used for CAD data, but actually at companies like ours, you find people are using it for all manner of different types of data. So it gets used for GIS, where it can perform reasonably well, and it even gets used for things like spreadsheets and documents and all sorts of random stuff. The way we use it in Arup in the US is purely for files, and so we're purely dumping files in here the same way that you would in Windows. A couple of my colleagues, or one of my colleagues here today is from one of our UK offices, where they do much more complex things regarding workflows, so they're having the whole approvals process managed by ProjectWise as well. If you have questions about that, I can point you at the right people to talk to. It's not something I know anything about. But for the purposes of today, it's a place where you can store your files. And for us in our company, it's a much better place to store your files than in Windows because it means people can get at those files from different companies and from different offices without suffering different download speeds or anything like that. There's a few dependencies on that, but generally, we all get the same performance, which is good. The same performance is slightly less good than you would expect from a normal computer, as we'll see as we go on, but whatever. And then specifically on the project, I was very pleased to see a Space Invaders slide hiding right in the beginning of one of the first sessions that we had on Wednesday. Because I put this together a while back just to sort of try and help me explain what we were talking about with this project. So we have basically, it's for a high-speed rail project, and we've got running down the left-hand side, I forget the numbers exactly, and so I'm going to do a rough count. I think that might be 11 different rows of basically different types of data coming into the project. And then running across the top, I hope that's 10 different columns of different geographical areas in which we were doing the work. The number at the front is the section of the project, and then the suffix on the end, the ZNC or whatever, is referring to which part of the state plane it's from in the state that the project is taking place. And so it's basically 10 different geographical areas on the project. So assuming I did my maths correctly, you've got 110 different files there. Of those, I believe 80 were being converted on a regular basis from CAD to GIS in order that our GIS teams could use them, and the other 30 were being converted regularly from GIS to CAD in order that our CAD teams could use them. So you've got basically two different sources of truth being blurred together and swapped over so that other people can use the data and can do informative things with it. Now, I don't know how you will feel about sitting there opening up 110 different CAD files, or sorry, 80 different CAD files and 30 different GIS files and converting them to their opposites and then writing that up onto the file system, but it doesn't really sound like much fun to me. And so what we started doing was looking at what the alternatives were in terms of storing the information, retrieving the information directly from ProjectWise. So we knew as a basic level that if we had this information on our C drive, then of course we could use FME to automate the conversion. But it wasn't on our C drive, it was in this weird cloud called ProjectWise, which is not cloud-based, but whatever. ProjectWise has two different APIs, as it turns out. One of them it uses .NET, and there's a few different requirements with that. I'm not too familiar with this API, actually, but I'd heard not great things from some of my colleagues who'd played with it. And there's a second one called the Web Services Gateway. And we started looking at both of these in some level of detail, and I gave up quite quickly on the first one. Actually, thinking about it, I've written .NET there. I think the API itself might be C-based, and it was one of my colleagues who had rewritten a .NET wrapper. And that, to me, is quite scary. I'm not going to go anywhere near anything that deep in code. The Web Services Gateway is intended kind of so that you can set up iPad apps and things like that that connect directly into ProjectWise. But we talked a bit to Saif and Dale, who's hiding at the back. He advised us that Bentley had told him to use the Web Services Gateway, and so we went down that route as well. And what we ended up doing was building custom transformers. And wait, I have exciting news for you before we go any further. I know you're all itching to ask me whether these are in the FME Hub. Who was itching to ask that? Yeah, you all were, yeah. I put them up about 4 hours ago, so yes, they are in the FME Hub. You can do what you want with them. They are provided with as much documentation as I wrote a couple of years ago when I put them together, and I will give you no more than that. For this one very good reason, which is that it's actually quite easy to explain what they do, but getting them actually working is quite difficult. So I will offer to help you there, but you might have to change some money between the two of us if you want help setting them up. But you're welcome to have a play with them yourselves and try and figure it out. I will delve a little bit deeper into some of these just so that we can explain or understand a little bit about what's going on in them. The first one that's kind of key is the data source retriever. What this does basically is it just fires off a single call to your nearest ProjectWise URL, and it asks it what ProjectWise data sources you as a user are allowed to see. And so this is where you will start. You will get a list of different data sources that you're allowed to access. Once you've got that, you can then poke around in the navigation hierarchy within ProjectWise. So you will provide one of these two with the information that you got from the previous transformer and also all your logon details for ProjectWise. And it will go away and it will pull back, in the case of the top one, the full navigation hierarchy, either for the top level of ProjectWise, if you give it no parameters, or for a particular folder within ProjectWise, if you tell it that that's what you want to look at. And in the case of the searcher, you use various conditions to search through for a particular file name. So it's all sounding quite easy so far, isn't it? It gets a bit more complex than that, I'm afraid. But let's walk onwards. So there's then 4 different transformers for handling objects and files within ProjectWise. Kind of the difference between a file and an object is not that big, really. Basically, objects can be files or folders. A file is a particular type of object within ProjectWise. And so, sorry, did I say there were 4? There's 5 transformers here. One that enables you to retrieve an object, one that enables you to delete it, one that enables you to update it, and one that enables you to create it. So all of those let you do things like rename a folder, rename a file, download file information, that kind of thing. And then the ProjectWise file downloader we set up that actually pulls the file itself if you've got one attached to your object in ProjectWise. And there's various functionality that's pre-canned in the Web Services Gateway API, so you can take a look at whether the file has actually changed since you last downloaded it, which is kind of cool as well. But then you have to go a bit deeper, and there's one thing that I completely forgot to mention, which is how you set up the ProjectWise Web Services Gateway in the first place. I'm not going to tell you that because I have no idea, honestly. It was an installer I managed to lay my hands on eventually after a lot of work. All you really need to do, as I recall, is have ProjectWise Explorer installed side by side with it. And there are some warnings I'll give you about if you want to actually do that, because it's not the nicest thing to work with necessarily, but it kind of works. So looking a bit deeper into some of these, as I say, they're all on the hub, so you can download these and take a look inside them if you want to look at them. I'll be checking the number of downloads within the next few hours, because I'm sure you're all going to rush away and try and find them. On a basic level, what we're doing for the most part is using an HTTP caller to call the Web Services Gateway and send a few commands at it. Then we're doing some JSON handling to pull apart the information we get back. There's a bit of standard FME rejiggery of different things as you get them in, so attribute copier and attribute renamer. Of course, we would all use an attribute manager now, but I wrote this, I think, before the attribute manager existed. Date formatter just reformats it, obviously, into a better date, and then we handle the ones that get rejected and send them out to our own rejected ports so that people can do with them whatever they wish. So fairly straightforward, actually. File downloader is also fairly straightforward. There's a bit more in here, and I can't really see what I put on that slide, so don't worry. But yeah, the key things, again, are an HTTP caller, which downloads the file. We had a bit of fun because the file was coming back as a binary, and for some reason when we wrote it initially in FME it was writing out as a text file, but I gather that's fixed in a more recent beta version, so there's some of that stuff you wouldn't need to do now, but we were basically downloading the file as an attribute, writing out a file, reading the file back in again for some reason, and I can't remember the rest of it. So anyway, there's some stuff to do with downloading files in that particular bit. And then creating an object, it gets a bit more complicated because you then have to, if it's a file, you have to upload the contents of the file with it. And so I once was talking to one of the FME doctors, I think it was maybe the last user conference I came to, and I was talking about the looper, or the looping functionality, sorry, in custom transformers. And he said he couldn't see why anyone would use looping within custom transformers. And the reason is things like this. When you're trying to upload a file, with the ProjectWise Web Services Gateway, it won't accept the entire file in one chunk. So you have to break down the binary file into lots of little pieces, feed ProjectWise each piece at a time. And there's a little bit of jiggery-pokery going on in the loop there to make sure that any pieces that get accidentally dropped during the process hopefully get uploaded a second time and that the whole thing works. It's not the smoothest ever, but it seems to always work, so, you know. All of these workspaces, custom transformers, they all come with no guarantees whatsoever, so if you break your ProjectWise, that's not my problem, basically. So the key lesson out of all of this really for me is that the HTTP caller is really cool. I love it to pieces. It's one of my favorite transformers, I think, now. That and the attribute file, what's it called? File reader or whatever, the one where you can actually run a little reader within the transformer. So anyway, this particular example we're looking at here, it's doing an if non-match query, which basically is saying, has the file changed since I last downloaded it? Because you get this little e tag gets downloaded each time that tells you what the version of the file that you downloaded was. And honestly, there isn't a lot else there. I've changed the timeout settings a little bit because it can be a little bit slow sometimes if it's having to download files in the background. There are a few other things I've tweaked here. You've got your authentication stuff down at the bottom, and other than that, it's all pretty much an HTTP caller out of the box, actually. And so there is, of course, the option of using Python instead if none of this really makes you happy. And this time I'm referring to it as Python. Last time I referred to it as .NET, and that's because one of our colleagues in Australia is clever enough to have rewritten the ProjectWise libraries for various different languages. And so his latest is to have done it in Python. And I haven't really seen this in action particularly. The workspace you can see running here is looking at the child folders of a parent folder. So it's doing a similar operation to one of the things I described a moment ago. My understanding is it requires ProjectWise Explorer to be open on the machine that has FME on it, which could be a downside potentially if you wanted to run that. And if you want more information about that, I can try and connect you up with the person who put these all together. As I say, I haven't used them myself yet. And so there are, of course, some shortcomings of the Web Services Gateway. It is intended as a simple web-based interface, and so it is for large and complex files, it's very slow indeed. The server where you have this little package installed, the one that FME is talking to, has to have an enormous amount of space on it. On this project that I described to you, we were working with often DGN files that referenced gigabytes of other DGN files, particularly imagery actually more than anything, but like enormous amounts of data. And there's some slightly odd aspects to this API where in the background it seems to download things again and again, even if it knows it has the file already. Definitely if you log in as a different user, then it will try and download all the files that it has already as the first user, because I guess it's handling permissions in a slightly funky way. And so there's a lot of slightly weird things. I think I've got another slide with some of the more specific bugs. Oh no, it was something I was looking at on the actual documentation I'd written earlier, whereby you might hit maximum file sizes within IIS and things like that. But as I say, that's all documented on the transformers. But just to give you a taster for some of the things that we've done with this, now we've got this tool. At its most basic, I kind of described already, converting DGNs to personal geodatabases. We, for a long time, have been using personal geodatabases because until the most recent version of ProjectWise, file geodatabases, as a lot of you probably know, were not supported by ProjectWise. They are now. I have yet to test them in anger to see how well they're supported. But for the longest time, we were using personal geodatabases because we preferred them to shape files because there's only a single file to mess around with. And generally it seemed to work reasonably well. So it's therefore with some slight disappointment that I find out that like Esri is stopping supporting personal geodatabases, and also SAFE is a little bit unsure about them, depending on whether you're on 32-bit or 64-bit. They're not fully supported, I believe. Dale's giving me an unknown face, so maybe we'll have some discussion about that later in the pub or something. So another example then, daily conversion of personal geodatabase files to file geodatabase files so that we can push them up to ArcGIS server. And then at the bottom, one of the more fun processes that we have with it, trying to deal with SFTP, which is a type of FTP, which we found that, again, FME didn't entirely feel happy with, unfortunately. So it was another of these cases where you have to find an external library that does the SFTP stuff. And that downloads a file, we convert that to personal geodatabase, and then we push it up to ProjectWise as a DGN, so that's kind of cool. And all these are things that without this automation, we would have had to have been doing manually. Of course, we wouldn't have done it daily because we're not stupid. And so, yeah, it really made the process a lot better. And then some of my colleagues around the world have done other things with it as well. So the top one is a really kind of clever and pretty funky process, actually, where they are able to get at what ProjectWise refers to as attributes, which to you and I, if we're GIS people, it's metadata, basically. And so they're pulling back things like when the file was last updated and stuff like that. And they're pulling together a little web interface so that you can search that, and they've got an API so that you can look at that kind of information really easily. That is not out-of-the-box behavior in either the FME stuff that we've put together or the ProjectWise APIs. They've really gone under the hood with that one, but apparently it works quite well. And then this bottom one is kind of cool as well, because if you've got ProjectWise set up with all the extra whizzes and bangs whereby it tells you like the whole tree of whoever has ever touched this file and uploaded it and downloaded it and what changes they made and things like that. That doesn't work when you do your own PDF export, for example, from ArcGIS and then push that into ProjectWise. All you get is the one record of this was updated. And so what they did was they basically used FME to rewrite the PDF containing additional metadata about it and then wrote that up into ProjectWise with the additional metadata as well. So kind of cool as well. And then I wrote this a very long time ago, just some general musings on why I bothered automating this in the process. And if you can be bothered reading through that, you'll see that there really wasn't much saving when I did it initially. It was basically a 5-hour saving between 26 hours at the top and 21 hours at the bottom. Although we did get the additional advantages of having a much more limited delay in data synchronization between different formats and a much reduced chance of human error. But actually this continued going for a lot longer, and so I've gone in and made a few corrections on here, and it would have added up to 130 hours altogether if we hadn't automated it, and it adds up to 73 hours altogether roughly after we automated it. So over the lifetime of the project it was definitely worth doing. A much bigger project, it could get, you know, really much bigger indeed. And then, of course, as I say, we've used the same process on loads of other projects. So, you know, it kind of doesn't really matter whether this project benefited or not, because we generally have benefited overall. So for me, automation is always the answer, with, yeah, inevitable small print, but, you know, it's always yes. As I say, I don't really need to talk about other APIs to you guys, I don't think, but basically the HTTP caller is amazing and I love it. And that's pretty much it from me, so thank you very much. Yeah, questions, please.
Is there a mic?
I can just repeat what you say if you like.
How do you handle boundary lines between the zones? Is it pretty precise boundary, or do you see some overlap sometime, or?
So the question was about how we handle overlap between the state plane zones and whether we see overlap on them. The data that we were getting, I think, was all statewide, and so we did the clipping, and so there was no problem, as I recall. The biggest problem we did have occasionally was because engineers were working separately to one another. Occasionally, it wasn't so much the boundary between the state plane, but the boundary between the two different bits of the project wouldn't necessarily line up exactly, and so we would have to point that out to our engineer friends and say, you need to fix this.
What were the challenges to automate, and did you put this on FME server? I didn't catch.
So the first question is what the challenges were to automate. It actually wasn't too challenging this. It took me about a day to work out the connections to ProjectWise, having decided that I was going to sit down and do it. It was basically the week after Christmas when no one else is at work normally, and you're sitting there thinking, what shall I do? And yeah, this is how I spent my Christmas. I'm sure you didn't do anything more interesting than that. The single biggest challenge actually was working out how to get all the ProjectWise stuff up and running, and that's not all the fault of any one individual. It was a whole slew of things, like the fact that within our organization, ProjectWise administrators are not necessarily the most communicative. And then also, I'm not the biggest fan of Bentley generally. They're not particularly great on documentation as far as I see it. You know, that was about as far as it got though. Once I'd delved in, it was fairly straightforward. And the second question, sorry, was whether we put it on FME Hub or FME Server?
FME server, you have to install the
It kind of depends how you've got your stack set up. I would set up a second server with this on it, like the ProjectWise connection and the ProjectWise Web Services Gateway. You could put it on exactly the same server as FME server, but I think with the amount of bloat that you get on the file drive here, that it would not be a good idea to put it on the same server. I have not done it myself because our FME server instance is in the UK, and so the latency would not be particularly good. But some of my colleagues in the UK have done it, and they report that it works fine. So, yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that you had some issues with SFTP. That's not really a project-wise thing, but can you describe what it is?
I don't remember exactly offhand what it was, and I did report it straight to SAFE, who have fixed it in the meantime. As I recall, it was something to do with the username and password not being passed through correctly, but I don't remember offhand. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. The question was about SFTP and what the problems were.
We experienced problems is using it to sending files after feature writer, and I thought that that was FTP caller with SFTP within it, and I thought, okay, the next feature reader waits for that to end, but that didn't, so it blew up the send files, corrupting it. So
Okay. I mean, I got a notification that the issue I had reported was fixed, I think in a very recent beta, so we'll be in the next FME, I believe.
I would suggest go and see the doctors about, I know we have had several customers over the last 2 or 3 years, here Lowland, the Danish mapping agency, wanting to use SF. There's SFTP and FTPS, and I have to watch out because I know one is easy and one is hard. I think we do them both, but please, it's Joel DePuter is the guy in the doctor's office to get up on this stuff.
I think with those things, the other thing that we struck a lot of problems with is our internal proxy as well, which tends to be the root of a lot of our problems. And I've got a feeling it was to do with how it handled proxies as well. So. But yeah, if you have problems, report them to SAFE. They're normally friendly. Normally.
Did you have any issues, legal or organizational issues, publishing those transformers to FME Hub, or did you just kind of spray them up there?
So the question is whether there were legal or organisational issues pushing the transformers to FME Hub, and yes, that is the reason that they were written about 2 years ago and they were just pushed up today. I did talk to our legal team and they had some concerns about whether, as a company, we should be sharing things, and I sort of said, well, who cares really? So, but yeah, you have them on the caveat that you won't sue me for using them. But it's on TV, so it must be true.
Did you also play with the check-in and check-out of ProjectWise? And you also made some transformation workflows?
So the question was whether we used check-in and check-out on ProjectWise and whether we did anything with workflows. So the second half, no, because we're not using them in our region of Europe, so I know nothing about workflows. Check-in and check-out, I believe, are not possible with the API that we used. One of my colleagues here can maybe talk to you about whether they're possible with the Python method. It may be possible. Okay, no then.
So I'll just mention that Stephen and Annabelle at SAFE are kind of working on taking the work that Roland did. He was kind enough to provide us with this almost a year ago, I think. And we're looking to make a real connector to ProjectWise ultimately, probably for FME 2018 or sometime in that timeline.
Keeps shifting.
Yeah, Stephen, when is it going to be done? It is hard
Yeah.
to do this. And so in the meantime, it's fabulous that yours are up there because they're there for everybody. They don't have to pay you. You can use that probably FME 2015 even if you wanted to.
Yeah, I think it says 2017 as a minimum because that's what I published them with, but you should be able to get them open in anything else, I think.
And I don't promise that we're going to do all of the functions that you did in your custom transformers because you might have done a more rich set than we'll do out of our first cut. But we are wanting to do a connector like we did with Dropbox and some of the other things, hopefully with ProjectWise, within the bounds of what we can do with that API.
Oh, one more.
would you recommend using this as a one-time
Yeah, would I recommend using it as a one-time conversion from ProjectWise to something else? Probably not, because it's not difficult, but it does take a bit of time to get your head around each time you do it. You have to sort of think through the process quite carefully.
Be able to retain the metadata and structure it.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks very much.
If there aren't any more questions, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Roland. Appreciate it.